Thank you so much, Nico. Thank you, Amanda. Thanks, Becky. Thanks, everybody at the University of Oregon for organizing this fantastic event. So I'll just briefly introduce myself, give a little introduction to our panel, and then allow Shin-pei and Alex to give some introductions as well, and then we'll kick off the panel. So as Nico said, I'm a journalist. I'm a reporter and editor at CityLab. It's now part of Bloomberg News. If you don't read our site, definitely head over there. We're actually going to be relaunching pretty soon, within the next few weeks as part of the larger Bloomberg News network, with some cool redesigned features and exciting reporting on transportation, among many other things related to urban policy and politics and the future of cities right now. I think, like everybody, in this virtual room, I'm just trying to keep track of the enormous upheaval that is happening beneath our feet, and trying to just kind of serve up the most illuminating stories that I can in this really bottomless story of change. And that includes the transportation space, which is definitely where I tend to focus. So I'm sure this has already been covered, and we all know, right, that transportation has just been brought to a near standstill across all modes, but particularly for shared modes, which is really the focus of our conversation today. We've got public transit scraping by with about 30% of its normal ridership here in the US, Uber and Lyft rides, taxi rides dropping off precipitously, and the shared scooter of bike business seemingly all but on the brink of potential collapse. We'll see. One recent analysis of credit card data from the New York Times found that spending on scooter rentals had fallen the most of all transportation modes by nearly 100%. And I didn't hear Selena say this, but that is in some large part because of retracting scooters from cities. Companies are laying off employees, valuations are coming down. And these are shifts in business models that I think a lot of people were predicting even at the start of the year. This has been an industry in a lot of flux all along, but these changes have really been accelerating to a pretty head-spinning degree. And yet, right, all of this comes at a time when it seems like any mobility mode that allows people to move alone, right, at a distance from other people should be potentially thriving or could start to thrive. We've got warmer weather. We have reduced car traffic on our roads. We've got these social distancing requirements. And there are some early signs that shared scooters and bikes could make kind of a comeback. In China, I was just reading that travelers are getting back on mobikes, which is the kind of biggest shared bike service there, and actually riding them about 20 to 30% longer distances than in the past. And we're also seeing personal e-bike sales skyrocket. So how have all these modes fared over the last few months, and what are some possible pathways for their future? So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Shin-pei and then Alex to go ahead and give their introductions.
Thanks so much, Laura, and really great to be here, Nico and Becky and everyone else at Urbanism Next. I thought what I'd do is just introduce a little bit about myself, and as it probably gives a little bit of insight into how I think about these problems and what I'm trying to do at Uber. So just going to share my screen here. Sorry. Hang on a second, let me pull up the right. Sorry about that. So I cover cities and transportation at Uber, and I think many of you may know my friend Joe Salzberg, who big shoes to fill here. I think he really laid the groundwork in terms of the course for platforming, leaning into the idea of multimodality, the potential, helping cities solve their most entrenched urban mobility problems. And I think, Uber really, to me, came from, nonprofit work, NGO work, advocacy work for many years, represented an ability to cut through to the culture change that I thought was really needed in order for people to start adopting more sustainable modes. So at Uber, I think of our work as, obviously there's the rides business, but as encompassing aspects of the urban environment that lean towards the additional choices beyond cars. Trying to green cars as a sustainability is very important to us. Thinking about serving communities that may not always have as many options historically. Think about other impacts such as on the built environment. And so I think of it as sort of, the rides plus the environment and the conditions in which we need to deliver the rides. And as we're moving into recovery, as Chris said, we're maybe it's not even moving into just now, but starting to think about it. And as states are starting to open up, and as other countries are able to manage or contain an outbreak, the way I'm thinking about this problem has been to deconstruct a bit of analogy and think about ways that we can really help support cities in solving this very unusual of social distancing, of wanting to get still needing to support essential workers, still needing to get people the essential goods that they need in order to shelter in place, and to help cities as they're facing huge economic constraints. So this is, these are just some, it's very simplistic in a way, but on the other hand, I think that we often, just the business side and the business units, et cetera. And I think sometimes it's useful to consider and rethink, like, what exactly is the value that we're bringing as a platform, and what are the ways that we can really offer and support cities and serve cities in this very, very strange situation. So look forward to having the conversation with Alex and Laura, and we're going to get the specifics of shared mobility, what's going to get, and the rest of it.
Thank you. We'll kick it over to Alex.
Hello. My name is Alex Pazuchanics. I am the Mobility Solutions Manager for the City of Seattle. As Nico mentioned, I was previously the Assistant Director in the City of Pittsburgh's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, which was an attempt to sort of create a Department of Transportation for the first time. So moving from a place where we were kind of building the plane as we were flying it to one of the departments that has kind of been around longest and really advanced the conversation around what it means to not just be a Department of Transportation, but a Department of Mobility. So my team is the Mobility Solutions team. What that generally means is kind of two distinct buckets that work pretty closely together. This idea of incorporating new and emerging mobility. How do we think about regulating business models, technologies? What does the future of transportation look like, and how do we make sure that it represents our values? And then on the other side, the travel options, travel demand management strategies. How do we make sure that we work with the things that generate trips, whether that be employers, special events, just regular old trips to the grocery store, and find ways to provide sustainable options to do that. So, that middle of the Venn diagram is essentially how we support people in Seattle getting around without owning a personal single occupant vehicle, or at least an internal combustion engine, and supporting those reductions for the climate impact in the transportation system. So it's been an interesting period over the last couple of months since taking this role. And in the last couple of weeks, I described it as an interesting fortnight to someone the other day. In 2019, the city of Seattle had record-breaking bike share ridership in our free-floating bike share program with 2 operators. plans for a new transportation electrification roadmap, including shared mobility, freight delivery, transit, not just sort of personal transportation electrification. We did have sort of a significant consolidation in the car share industry. 3 operators over the course of 2019, either leaving Seattle or ultimately leaving the market entirely, and sort of began planning for a scooter share launch, a scooter share pilot in 2020. Over the last couple of months, a lot has changed, obviously. Consolidation in the micromobility space, ultimately leading to, on Thursday, the suspension of bike share operations in the city of Seattle. We anticipate sort of having bikes back on the road in a matter of weeks, but the fact remains, at the moment, there isn't a shared micromobility option in the city of Seattle. Plummeting demand for shared mobility during this time, obviously, same in the rest of the markets, although not dissimilar from the decline in transit. Obviously, some good news in 2020 in the city of Seattle in particular has been some major expansions in Streets for People, our Stay Healthy Streets initiatives, reducing vehicle traffic on streets, making them available for walking and biking, and ultimately leading to some permanent streets, permanent sort of low impact streets, and continued pervasive uncertainty. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with Laura and Shin-pei as well. I think a number of these trends are things that we had anticipated in one way, shape, or form in 2020, but there was certainly some accelerant put on the fire over the last couple of months.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Alex, if you can go into a little bit more detail about like where things stood from the city's perspective at the start of 2020. I guess with a focus on the kind of shared bike and scooter space, but also with ride hailing. What was the city sort of anticipating, and how had those modes kind of fit into the broader transportation landscape at that point?
I mean, I think it's hard to remember, but there was a moment in time really not that long ago before not just the pervasiveness of shared mobility, but even the concept of shared mobility. The first bike share program, the first dockless bike share program in the city of Seattle was in 2017. I think the first birds in Santa Monica were the fall of 2017. So this is still a very nascent industry, and one that I think had not had been sort of expected to continue for quite some time, both in bike share and in sort of emerging device types, both scooters, sit scooters, stand scooters. All of this is still sort of a relatively new development, and I think in 2020, the city of Seattle was anticipating or is anticipating that there is still demand for micromobility, number one, and shared micromobility, number two. But I think had not necessarily figured out entirely how we wanted to incorporate reliance on shared mobility in the broader transportation ecosystem, because the city had actually had some difficult experiences with traditional docked bike share, right? So I think there is still a sense of uncertainty, unprovenness of the business model, and making sure that in a place where transit is popular and is heavily relied upon, that there's a general understanding that things are orbiting around transit as kind of our anchor to our transportation network strategy. And I think that we hadn't necessarily resolved there. I think on the car share space or the ride share space, you were definitely seeing increasing reliance on ride hail sort of as a mode of choice, particularly during the city of Seattle's period of maximum constraint with sort of infrastructure reliance. So I think there was an expectation that car share was kind of here to stay. The city had actually changed its fee structures associated with car share. At the end of last year, there was an expectation that car share was kind of admittedly now a decade later from the first car share deployments or rideshare deployments, sort of understood to be a little bit more ingrained in the fabric of what the transportation system was looking like.
Yeah, and I mean, you sort of went through some of the fleet reductions and substantial changes that the city has seen in the availability of some of these services in the last few months. I mean, what can you say about, obviously travel demand just across the board has plummeted, but I wonder what you can say about, I mean, have riders been affected? Is there any way to know, how riders have been affected by some of those changes, and what do you kind of foresee in the coming months and years?
I mean, we've definitely over the course of the last couple of months, as car share exited, we've been getting comments from the general public, from concerned residents who have essentially said, I've made my decision on where to live or whether or not to own a car, kind of based on a certain set of assumptions, that transit was going to be there, that I had access to a car share, that I had kind of these shared mobility options. And I think that there's a level of increased uncertainty that's kind of only been accelerated as a result. And I think our concern is, putting the TDM hat on for a second. Those are exactly the seismic changes in sort of status that lead to a behavior change, like going out to buy a car, or like making driving sort of the dominant mode of choice, because that's the sort of next trick. And in the same way that those sticking points are positive when you can get someone to change their commute into taking transit, or change their commute into a carpool or a van pool, and can be those tricks are difficult to dislodge. Similarly, I think there's concern that it's now going to be difficult to dislodge people back to those modes if and when they do reappear in Seattle or something new comes in.
Yeah, thank you for that. I definitely want to return to this question of what the city is thinking and kind of strategizing around with respect to possible, mode shift nudges. But I want to turn back to Shin-pei and hear more from you about what this pandemic has meant, with this weird time, as you put it, has prompted Uber to reconsider, I suppose, with respect to its business strategy. I guess particularly around, I'm interested in hearing about ride-hailing services, of course, as its primary service, but there's been a lot of flux in the micromobility space, with Uber kind of selling off Jump to Lime, and also leading this $170 million investment in Lime to really sustain it for the future. So would love to hear from you from a strategic standpoint, what coronavirus has meant for Uber.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much a work in progress across the board for all these companies. I mean, this is a completely unprecedented event in so many ways. And I mean, I think it's been said over and over again, but fragility of all the systems and the hacks that we've made across the board on technology, from technology to social systems and support systems, it's, they're really coming to light. On the business model front, I think that, there was always, as you mentioned, there was always talk of consolidation. There was always talk of, the business models needing to be, let's say, right-sized. I think rides is the business model that has been sorted in a way, but there's been billions of dollars poured into figuring that out. And I think with micromobility, I think it deserves that chance as well, and it requires kind of singular focus to a certain degree. And it is different, managing assets than it is kind of managing a technology platform. So I think that in some ways it made sense to let another company work through of solving the unit economics around micromobility while keeping those options on our platform. I'm frankly, I think there might be more of a chance for us as a transportation platform company, to offer more choices and third-party options on our app than potentially there was before. because you know, this is the strategic partnerships is something that we're thinking about significantly during COVID, and now I think in post-COVID. I mean, not just with private companies, but also with public agencies. It's something that you know, cities have reached out to us because I think in cases where they could see that the technology could help, they've been reaching out to us and asking for our help in supporting, you know, meal delivery or rides for essential workers, or helping to backfill transit service around the edges. And I think that, you know, we haven't given up the idea of, you know, kind of the tenets of say, you know, transit being the backbone, walking and biking, lots of pedestrian space and slow lanes, and you know, I think there's so much more to do to build out those. I think that as a company, what we can offer is, you know, some of our capability on the technology to try to enable and support cities as they go and I think make some really hard decisions on where they're going to, you know, they have fewer resources and where they need to direct those resources. So that's a bit of how I think, you know, we're thinking about the landscape moving forward. I think from the business strategy side, obviously the strategic partnerships is not limited to micromobility. I think people might have seen, you know, even on the low deliveries or the Grubhub conversation in the news. I think that, you know, there's ways of reaching more people and providing service to more people that are possible from business strategy perspectives. But on the transportation and built environment realm, you know, I think more choices for more people, especially as we're dealing with very, you know, a lot of uncertainty in terms of how, you know, what commute patterns will look like, and, you know, how are people going to be moving around the city. I think a lot of that is still to be determined.
Thank you. Yeah, yes, the kind of movement to transporting objects rather than people is a really interesting kind of trajectory. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about the relationship to public transit, because I think this is so interesting, right? I think the kind of question around how ride hailing and public transit sort of interrelate has been a contentious one kind of in this world, you know, for many years. There's, you know, there was sort of this message that companies like Uber and Lyft had, that, you know, that they're complementary to public transit, and there have been a number of partnerships in different municipalities to provide paratransit and kind of supplementary services, but then also research, you know, showing that ride hailing can draw people who can afford it away. And you know, you're talking about kind of transit as a backbone. You know, initially I might think that the big declines in transit that we're seeing now could be a good thing for Uber, but then we're also seeing people moving away from just shared modes across the board. So I'm just wondering, like, have the fluctuations that you've been observing and the kind of strategizing that you're doing, has it made you kind of rethink or you know, review the relationship to transit and ride hailing in a new way?
You know, in some ways, I feel like this is a time for us as a company to return to some of the original tenets. I saw something, an article the other day that said something like the dream of a multimodal future is fading for Uber. And I actually think, no, this is like, it is more vivid than ever. We have to really lean into the ability to provide shared modes and of course meet the very high safety standards, but really try to direct that capability in ways that can help support cities and be a bridge. Right now, I think transit we still believe in transit. I think that given where things are with the public safety situation and the pandemic and the need for physical distancing, for maybe even reduced capacity or some line cut or what have you, I think that we can potentially be a bridge during this time, work with transit agencies. I really believe that transit customers are also our customers. Like and maybe use transit regularly and use ride hail infrequently, but we share the same customers. I moved to a city where, even though I live in a transit, I moved from New York to San Francisco. I live in a transit-rich neighborhood, transit score of like 99.7 or something, nearly a perfect 10. Only 38% of the people here commute by transit, which I thought was remarkable. But what I've experienced here is with a bicycle, and knowing that I'm never going to be stuck because I have bike share and I have ride hail, I don't need to buy a car. And I think that is the package and of options I really want. I really think about in terms of how we collectively drive down car ownership moving forward. I'm very dismayed by the early figures coming out. Like, I think that if you have a car right now, you are likely driving it, and so the idea of the idea that we really need to all work together to make this, to prevent that from happening, is very front of mind to me. And I think there's a business interest in it. Like, if we as a company are trying to bring back ride hail to a level close to where it was before, we have to think a lot preventing people from getting a car. And also, I think what's interesting is for transit agencies and their customers, even, for example, paratransit is something that I think we can deliver really well compared to conventional modes, the conventional way of delivering paratransit, where it is demand versus a 24-hour reservation with a 2-hour wait window. Those paratransit customers, many of them may be immunocompromised, maybe they need to stay, they're being asked to stay at home, and the transit agencies have been thinking about ways of bringing goods to them and using like TNC, the logistics side of it, let's say, to help continue to support those communities. And I think that's the kind of creative thinking I think that we all need to kind of shift into. So a lot of the kind of old ways of trying to separate the modes and look for the competition. And I think that this is a moment to ways that it could complementary, ways it could be bridging this, people in this very strange and unique situation, and move forward from there.
Yeah, and let's kind of segue over to hearing from Alex more on this public transit question. I mean, I don't know what the exact ridership figures have been like in Seattle, or where they stand, now versus a month ago, but that 30% ridership figure I cited is like roughly average for a lot of the big cities in the United States, and that is largely essential workers, right? These are the folks who are riding are largely people who have been powering our economy, working in grocery stores and in hospitals and pharmacies, and who may not suddenly have the means, right, to go out and buy a car, or even necessarily be the most likely candidates, right, to switch onto a scooter or whatever it may be. So we know that there will be this kind of core ridership base. And yet, transit agencies have slashed service, with the reduced demand and their own staffing, health-related staffing issues, right? And facing a kind of perilous new financial picture, as so many local governments are, divisions of local government, I should say. So, what I guess the question is, what does local government really owe to these riders, right? With respect to the provision of transit, or really mobility across the board.
No, I mean, I think it's a really important question. And I think, one of the scary things is that we have essentially inverted a pretty fundamental TDM message, which is, take transit, to have, public entities, to have the buses say like essential trips only, on the scroll. That's going to be a difficult sort of message to not walk back from, but modify over time, let's say, as we want people to return back to transit. it is important to recognize, and I think you bring up a good point, Laura, that like that 30% is not evenly distributed across lines, across geographies. There are routes in Seattle that saw 97 or 99% reductions in ridership compared to some routes that are only down about half of what their normal ridership are. And so I think it reinforces that transit is a lifeline, is a critical service for those folks. And I think one of our challenges is going to be making sure that as we hopefully sort of reinstitute service, as we sort of make accommodations, we're making accommodations to the population that has a destination that they are trying to get to, right? That 97 to 99% reduction isn't because all of those people are now driving to downtown Seattle to their office building to work, right? It's because those jobs are teleworking or whatever the case may be. The emphasis needs to be placed on how we provide service to not only people who don't have options, but people who have places to go. And I think that that's going to be really critical for that economic recovery component.
Yeah, I mean, can you share any is there kind of specific thinking around that emerging at this point? I mean, I'm especially interested, I guess, because, Seattle has been in recent years kind of a national success story, right? With, even the modest increases in transit ridership there have really been against the grain from what we've seen in other US cities, with the city really investing in more frequent transit downtown, reprioritizing lanes, making free public transit available to certain commuter groups downtown. So, it kind of seems like this is a period that cities are entering where, ridership as like a objective needs to kind of shift. But yeah, I mean, how does the city kind of maintain some of that progress?
I think some of it is definitely sort of continuing on that infrastructure side, right? Making sure that the experience of riding transit is still dignified, is still a advantage to the folks that do actually need to take advantage of that service. So, whether that's the transit lanes or transit signal prioritization, I think the city or the region is doing kind of the shadow bus model right now in terms of less availability, but double buses in those sort of peak times and periods on those peak routes. I think the other thing Selita mentioned in her comments, and a number of agencies are really thinking about the way that how we redefine transit in a technical sense. I think King County Metro, our partners, our closest partners on the transit side, have already done a lot of that. We have one of the most successful van pool, publicly run van pool programs in the country. One of the changes that was made within the last couple of weeks was actually dropping the number of required riders in a van pool to 2. In an effort to sort of encourage van pool as a potential option or strategy to kind of keep people serviced when trip reductions change, or when service availability changes. I think ditto is, we're working closely with our transit partners to get a better sense of how we would define or think about carpool as a strategy that is, if not transit, certainly transit adjacent. And, is there a way that carpool and vanpool can kind of build that level of trust with your co-riders that I think is challenging to deliver on mass transit, where, the whole point is the large number of riders that you would interact with.
Yeah, that trust component seems really, really key. I was speaking with a transportation researcher at the World Resources Institute who's based in Beijing yesterday, and he was saying that ridership has bounced back, not to full levels there. Traffic levels at peak rush hour are like at 110% of their baseline from last year. But ridership on transit is coming back there, with folks wearing masks, and there are temperature checks. And he also mentioned, of course, that you have to scan your QR codes so that the government can track you, right? In case someone does get infected, everyone, can be notified who was on the car with you. And that's not something that's as likely or easy to imagine in a US context. So can you speak a little bit more about that kind of trust factor? And then I'd love to hear the same from you, Shin-pei. Uber is the kind of company that could potentially step in with the kind of van pooling services, or maybe like connective tissue for the sort of program that Alex is describing. But we're still seeing some, hesitation around just shared modes across the board, right? So I'd love to hear more about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the carpool and vanpool side, like it really is it's a transportation version of the same conversation that is happening in terms of like social interaction, right? The story about, you can pick one other family that you're allowed to interact with and only that family. I think it's that opportunity that we are going to have to kind of rebuild social fabric, and that includes rebuilding social fabric from a transportation perspective. As those destinations reemerge, and I do think that there will be a little bit of a lag, particularly for large downtown office building. Like the sort of folks that were first to telework are likely going to be some of the last to return to that normal environment, quote unquote normal, which I think gives us some time to continue to iterate and expand. But I think that we on our side, like the public agencies, the best we can do is start to provide or continue to provide a clean ecosystem, right? That sanitization process, things like that, like it does matter to people's level of trust and level of confidence. But ultimately, we're not going to be in the position to be able to encourage trust in fellow human beings. That's a deeply sociological challenge that I think transit agencies are just going to be one piece of.
Yeah, I think that this trust issue, and especially with safety concerns, is just paramount, right? These are really hard problems to solve. They're costly problems to solve. I would say, in the conversations on our side about how we should move forward, ensuring the highest level of safety and cleanliness and sanity, in every way on both sides to protect the drivers, to protect the riders. This is a dominant conversation and really hard to solve. There were a couple of announcements that we made this week where we're asking drivers and riders to wear masks if they do need to take a trip. And we're looking into other ways we can support drivers in equipping their cars so that they can maintain some kind of state of cleanliness, and even asking drivers to potentially wipe down after each ride. This is really expensive for them, and for us, we're actually supplying a lot of equipment for them to do this. It is a very, very challenging situation. I also think, though, if I think about travel demand management strategies that I think everyone's going to be really leaning into, and the way that transit agencies or even DOTs might be rethinking their kind of operations, there's a role here where, for example, we suspended pool at the moment, but we could potentially, for commute purposes, maybe create like a limited, bubble of a pool where the other riders that you're going to be going into work for, as a way of just supplementing the service that a city might be able to or not be able to provide at this very moment. I think that in some of the other outside of the US, we have, there was a Uber bus, there were high capacity vehicles. Maybe we reduce the number of passengers in the high capacity vehicles to maintain some aspect of space. So I think that, I do think that there's ways of trying to solve for this together. And we're also seeing with transit agencies, like maybe the first easiest thing to do as they're, making sure that people who do need to get to work are able to have at least a ride. So that's some of the ways that we've been partnering with transit agencies, like the late night service, and we've expanded the service area in this field so it captures more grocery stores, for example. And so those are some of the ways that we can help supplement any sort of cuts that might be in place.
We just have a few minutes left before we move on to question and answers from the audience, but I want to kind of return to one of the premises of this panel, which is this kind of relationship between the public and private sectors at this moment. And I think it's interesting to think back, right? I guess ride hailing and the scooter business, I think especially, in the micromobility space, which Uber's kind of a little bit more out of at this point, this week compared to last. But it's interesting, like when they came in 2017, 2018, the pitch was kind of like, here's this amazing new mode, we're going to help people shift away from solo driving. We're going to increase just overall biking and walking and transit use. And we're going to do it at no charge at all to cities. How that's worked out. I mean, right now it's looking like a very challenging premise to kind of follow through on, right? Or promise to keep. And so I'm just wondering, like, as this crisis plays out and as you two both think about what a sustainable mix of modes looks like in your respective cities and in your respective purviews, like what does each side kind of need from one another right now to keep things to get to that sort of desirable, sustainable place, and please tell me what that looks like too. I'd love to know. But whether that's subsidies from local government or promises about infrastructure, like Alex, you mentioned a little bit the pedestrian and bike lane build out that Seattle has been, or opening Seattle's been doing. So go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the really exciting question, albeit a really challenging question. Is I think like there's broad understanding that the unit economics of micromobility are presently challenging, possibly like insurmountable in their present form. There's a lot that goes into that: the geography, the quality of the infrastructure, like what it's going to take to convince people to take trips. But the opportunity is huge, right? There's a moment of where we are encouraging people to kind of be able to live comfortably within or doing our best to try to have it achievable to like live within that 20-minute neighborhood, so to speak, that micromobility is sort of perfectly tuned for. So I think what cities need is a better understanding from industry to really like unpack the books a little bit and understand not just what profitability looks like, but the way in which expectations or desires of the public have cost implications on the side of the operators, right? I am going to have a much easier time. Cities are going to have a much easier time, if we are targeting trips to support low-income ridership, right? Because we recognize that those are cost drivers, or trips in remote areas, right? I think a better understanding, not just of like, we gain or lose X amount on any given trip, but really unpacking sort of why trips are taken helps us prioritize and value the way that we need to support them differently. I think the other piece is acknowledging that like shared is not the be all and end all of micromobility, and there are ways to encourage biking, scooting, whatever the case may be, that don't necessarily need to benefit from the network effects that a shared system can provide, as long as we kind of acknowledge that there are kind of different conditions that make a shared network more optimal compared to places where private ownership of those services or leased models or whatever the kind of new version of the business model looks like?
Such a great question. I agree with Alex about this is like the billion-dollar question, right? Like the size, the valuations of this sector is really insane. I often think about how do we operationalize these goals? How do we operationalize these shared goals? I don't think, on both sides of whether you're public or private, that, I don't think people are looking at this situation and thinking, I just want to keep carbon exactly where it is. I think people are actively trying to sort out, how do we drive down carbon? How do we get more people? We don't operate well when there's congestion. We are very, very interested in trying to figure that out. So I think there's, if the narrative, I think from Uber's perspective is, it broke a lot of rules. It went all in to disrupt an industry and got to a certain place. And then there was this idea of a multimodal or a mode shift that was possible now in a universal way that could mirror the initial disruption. And at the time that I think that it came out with this vision, adding Jump and adding transit to the platform, I think cities were kind of like, we're not going to let that stuff happen to us again. No more disruption that we can't control. And and we're going to really, really like clamp down on any more disruption. And I think the scooter business really tested a city's flexibility. As much as a scooter promises to deliver so much, like the majority of trips are less than 3 miles. Many of them are less than 1 mile. Scooters take care of that, right? But they clutter the sidewalk. They're so hard to manage. People do all sorts of crazy things with them because they're so lightweight. So I think, there was this impetus to try to clamp down and control as much as possible. And so I think moving forward, though, I think there's a lot of opportunity to really aim for those performance outcomes and to think about ways we can guide both sides to achieve those same outcomes there. For example, I know some of the things that we really wanted to deliver were serving low-income communities with bike share. It was super hard, though, with the way that some cities defined low-income communities and what equity meant to them. And on the business side of things, maybe 90% of our revenue would come from 10% of the service area that the city would define. But it made it untenable when we also had to service everything else, but without any public support or support for the people who would want to take the bike. So I think that there is some idea like right sizing. It's not necessarily a subsidy for us per se, but I would say a way of making that option much more available for a larger number of people in the communities. I think another aspect is, bike lanes have shown to increase bike usage by like 400%. And we would have loved to have all those new rides. It would have it would have helped enormously with economics. Bike lanes can be stopped by one neighbor on one block. And I think DOTs around the country have been very, that has really been quite challenging. And so I think there's another opportunity where we're very supportive of bike lane expansion, very supportive of open street networks. We've been manually adding some of these open street networks to our base maps just to support cities that are implementing them. And I think finally, the last thing I want to say is like related to the carbon issue and just as a way for operationalizing our this picture of multiple modes, we should be looking at what is that impact and maybe driving towards that basket of transportation options through that lens versus, trying to pit different modes against each other and sort out the economics on their own.
I have one more lightning round question for the two of you before we move on to our Q&A from the audience, and that is, do you miss your commutes? And if so, why?
I'm a city person, so I miss walking around, and yeah, my commute was always like, there's this great article in the Times about how the stops along the way when we get out in the city, the other end on the other side of the counter, it's like our social life. And I miss that tremendously.
I similarly miss it. It's actually, I take the light rail in typically, and that was my Duolingo language practice time. There's probably a Swedish word for that, like sense of solitude in the middle of a crowd. I haven't learned it yet though, because it's been much harder to give myself a routine for learning lessons without the commute.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for a great panel. I will kick it over to Becky Steckler, who's going to take questions from the audience.